Okay. All right, hey guys. Let me get my slides back one real quick. So it looks like my slide's getting cut off a bit. That's all right. So first off, I want to, as a sponsor, I want to thank everybody for coming. You know, it's really great to be here, and we really love helping out with this stuff. And so I'd like to thank Ryan for putting it on as well. So I don't want to tell you necessarily about Bluehost products for a minute, but what I want to do is tell you about what Bluehost cares about. What Bluehost cares about is community and open source. We contribute to a number of open source projects and a number of communities, meetup groups, other open source conferences. These are the things that Bluehost really cares about. We don't only talk, but we use. Internally, we use open source. Even people in our billing department are using different flavors of Linux. And we have people throughout the company who contribute to all kinds of different open source projects. And so we live open source every day. And we contribute. And so also with community, we get involved in our community. We grow, we help our local community, we help the developer community, all these things, because we really want a strong community around these open source projects. And so we try really hard to be involved with all of these communities. All right, and I'm going to get started on a presentation. So, working with third-party APIs, LoopConf, it's been awesome so far. I've been watching from the booth out in the hall, but a lot of really great presentations. But so I'm Mike Hansen. I work on the open source team at Bluehost. We're involved in those community things. I'm a WordPress core contributor. You can find me on Twitter at MikeHansenMe. Also my website, mikehansen.me. I was supposed to blog there. I haven't. But so, hold on one second. I'm going to see if I can get these, because we're missing a piece of the slide. Or maybe not. Okay, here we go. We'll just do it like this. So an idea. Lots of great things start out as an idea. You're trying to solve a problem. That's where, you know, a lot of great ideas come from, is trying to solve that problem. So when you're doing it, you might run into some hurdles. A lot of these in WordPress, if you're building a plugin, can be around the environment, because you never know what environment you're going to be working in. And so you look, and sometimes the right answer is to try to find a service that solves your problem. Look around and see if you can find a service that solves your problem. And if not, you may need to create it, but it still might be the right solution. So finding the API or creating it, basically when I have a problem and I'm trying to find a solution, I go looking for other people who may have had the same problem and how they went about solving it. Sometimes I find something that can solve my problem, but it's hard. You need to find their developer resources, and that's not always the easiest thing to find, because maybe it's not their main concern. Maybe it's not their main customer. Sometimes you can use like a Google search and just go find it more easily that way. So what do I look for once I find their developer resources? I look at their documentation. I look at how much it's being used, and how do they support old versions. Do they have an old version? Because, as you know, an API is a promise, and how they keep that promise means a lot. And so when I'm looking at an older version, I look at how they handled their old version when they introduced their new one. Did they notify their developers? Is the old version still running and just not receiving new features? And how was the transition for people who were using it? Because these things are important, and these are the kind of companies who take their API seriously. So I hear people refer to plugins sometimes as workers, and I just want to get that out of the way. But what seems to me is when a plugin depends on a service, and the plugin doesn't necessarily do anything itself, that's what I see as the worker. It's not the product. The product is the service. And so that's just a quick note. When I hear that, workers or products and that kind of stuff, they're always just talking about a plugin, mostly. So how does WordPress help? Well, the HTTP API is really great for making the requests. It has options, transients, meta. The WP error is even nice. It has a lot more. WordPress tries to make this really easy for you. So one of the things I really like about WordPress is that everything seems to make sense. When you're reading the function is pretty descriptive. It tells you a lot about what it's doing. So I've been using WordPress since WordPress 2.7 or so, and I went and looked at the WP remote functions because I wanted to see kind of the backstory on that. And I found a ticket. It was around 4,800 or something, and there was a lot of conversation around why they needed some standardized way to interact with other services. And there was a lot of discussion about how to do it the best way, and ultimately they came up with the HTTP API. And what the problem was that in core they were using different ways to interact with services, mostly WordPress.org, and it was causing problems. And you take this with the environment problem, and it's compounded. And so they came up with this to solve the problem. It has a variety of fallbacks for transports. So you can use the functions and count that they're going to work. So first thing I want to talk about is fetching data with using the HTTP API. Basically, what I like to do is create a wrapper, set my defaults, and then use functions like WP parse args to get all that back. The reason I like to do this is because every single time I interact with my function that then works with this API, it can be really simple. It can be my function with one parameter. It doesn't have to be the whole set of parameters. It helps keep the code cleaner in other places. And with the functions, it's really nice to merge the defaults and the additional parameters. Using the HTTP build query is nice because I can work with a filter right up until I build out the URL and make the request. So these are a few things that WordPress and PHP even help with. So an array filter, I use that to clean out, like here I have this key of seller and it has an empty value. So I don't want to pass that every time, so I just clean it out. A few other things you can do. Well, I'll get to that. So one of the things in there is errors. So dealing with errors, there's basically two types of errors that you'll need to deal with when working with an API. And that's basically your HTTP errors. So if nothing ever came back, or it came back a 404 or something. Or the WP error. So in this snippet of code, we check is WP error to make sure it's not a WP error first. We do a little bit of validation, basically, just making sure it's longer than 10 because we were getting some strange responses that were shorter than 10 but still validated. So we added that. But we want to make sure it's at 200. And then after that, we get into the second type of errors that we're going to run into, which is where the API returned some data, but there was still an error, even though. So they're telling you about the error that they're giving you. So this is like when you're interacting with authorized.net or something like that. I mean, imagine like invalid credit card, like that kind of stuff. They're giving you a valid response, but they're telling you about an error that happened somewhere else. And depending on what you're building, you may or may not want to pass that along to the user. So for us, and checking this one's easy. It just says success 1 or 0. And if it's 0, we get out of there. But if it's 1, we continue. This is also a good place to validate the data and sanitize it and do some things like that. So for example, if you're working with an API for like MLS or something like that, and you might have local or state laws that say that you have to have like the listing broker named before you can put out a listing. So this is where you'd want to do those checks as well. And just make sure that all the fields you need are available, and that everything looks kind of like what you want it to. If you're expecting a phone number, make sure that it looks like a phone number. So after we do that, after we've sanitized it and prepared it, we're going to store it somewhere. And depending on what you're working with, depends on where you may want to store it. So if you're working with something that's time sensitive, transients are a pretty good place. If it's not time sensitive, but it's just a general, you could store it in an option. But sometimes, if it's more user specific, you could put it in the user meta, post meta. You could even create a custom post type if that makes sense for the amount of data you're receiving. So post meta and user meta are pretty similar, and so are options and transients, but I want to just talk about transients for a quick second. This is basically another one of those scenarios where WordPress built a function so that you could count on it to work with or without caching. So by default, it goes into the database, and if you have something like memcached available, it will use that. To a user, this makes no difference. They don't know where stuff's getting served from. Caching's just obviously faster. So with the transient, it's just the same as an option, but we pass in, how long until it expires. And so in WordPress, there's also these constants, these time constants, and they make it, it doesn't get much easier than this to work with this stuff. And so with these things combined, you're using the HTTP API, storing things, you're validating, using the sanitizing functions. These things in combination are really powerful. So, next, this brings me to something that matters all the way through, trust. Even though you're working with this API, you can't trust it because you don't know what may come, and it may even be user input. So always treat it as user input because you never know what might happen, and you don't want something that sneaks by them to sneak by you. So securing the data again, so don't trust it. Validate it, sanitize it, and escape it before you output it. And working with the HTTP API, authentication is pretty easy. Authentication isn't always about accessing secure data. Sometimes there are APIs that have you register for a key, mostly simply so they can limit how often you're hitting it with your specific key, or track how often you're hitting it. It may not be about security. If it's about security, you'll want to implement something more like OAuth or something that's better. So for these two examples, they're just basic. So basically, when you're using the remote request function, or remote post, or anything for that matter, any of the remote functions, you have your key, and you can stick in the headers, and it's a key value pair. It's really easy. And this works with any header values you need to pass back and forth. And so it's just really easy because it's just, it's a multi-dimensional array that basically just makes sense. And then another thing that I've seen before is like just passing the key as part of the query. So this is the same situation like the wrapper function earlier. We're grabbing the key, we're merging the arguments and building our query, making it look like a URL, and then we're going to make that request. So speed. We're doing all of this, and you might say, why am I storing it? Why am I doing all these things? Because when a user loads a page and it loads slow, it's bad, and you might not get a second chance. So try to make it as fast as possible by storing it and serving it local. If 2 people come to your site and meet the exact same criteria, wouldn't it be great if every person after, the second person and every person after had a really great experience? And so speed matters. And you need to keep the data as close as you can and for as long as possible. So, for example, in the MOJO plugin, we pull in some themes, and they might get updated, every hour a new theme gets added or something like that. But it's not really that important that it's updated every hour. And so we actually keep it for 24 hours. It's still, there, and it's good. So it doesn't need to be updated every 30 minutes to an hour. 24 hours is reasonable. So we keep it as long as possible, that makes sense. So taking this a step further than storage and speed, timing. Like I say, you may not get a second chance. If they load that page and the first time it's really slow because it's making that request, and they might not view the page the second time to get the better experience. And so with timing, if you can time your requests correctly and store them before the user can get there, and if it makes sense, it's more of a thought process than actual more code or anything like that. It's just thinking through the way that things execute and trying to provide a better experience. So one thing that we're doing in the development copy of the next plugin is we're going to hook into like admin footer, and we're going to make a non-blocking request using the HTTP API. Hit the admin AJAX and load up 3 or 4 of those pages before the user ever even gets there. So when the user hits the first page, it's fast. It's like the second time they hit it before, but they never know that because we're timing things a little better. And so because it was blocking false, it doesn't wait for the results. And since we hit admin AJAX, it creates a new PHP thread. And so it executes. It might take 10 seconds or something, but it doesn't matter because it's not directly getting in the user's way. And that's all I got. Those are just some things that I've been dealing with in a lot of plugins, basically sanitizing them, validating, storing them, trying to make the best sense of your product, and making the best user experience when they're using your product. So again, you can find me on Twitter at MikeHansenMe. You can contact me through my website, MikeHansen.me. Thanks, guys.